I would like to talk about the impact of artificial intelligence and or so-called complex algorithmic systems into the idea of the self and how it also relates to societal changes. And I would like to do that in three steps. I first argue that when we talk about algorithmic systems, complex algorithmic systems, we are understanding them as products, but they are actually a form of infrastructure. Then I would go into the consequences of this new type of infrastructure for our idea of the individual and our idea of the self. And in the very end, I will go deeper in what it means using AI infrastructure or algorithmic infrastructure for individual services and how the individual is being used and embedded into the algorithmic programs to become not only a user of this technology but part of that infrastructure and co-author and co-creator of these new technologies and what type of impact and implications this has for our idea of autonomy, but also for our idea of how to get a hold of it from a legal and ethical perspective. What are the consequences? So when we talk about AI or new technologies, the claim is that what they do is democratize access to assistance through personalization. So services based on artificial intelligence claim to smartly adapt to the user, making the digitization more personal and with this more accessible to more individuals. But computational services are more than merely a product. They are a form of infrastructure. They are what I call immaterial infrastructure. And with this, as any other type of infrastructure, they are not about the individual. They are, in fact, not only unable to capture the individual, but a form of keeping individuality outside the system. So if we start first with the definition of infrastructure and its political dimension, we can talk about it as the physical Foucaultian dispositive distribute power, create the conditions for societal inclusion or exclusion, and create and shape the space of a society. So dispositive is a concept that was developed by Michel Foucault, and what he meant by that is I quote, a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, the said as much as the unsaid. And those are the elements of the dispositive. And the dispositive itself is the system of relations that can be established between all these elements. Now, artificial intelligence, to me, and having a closer look, it's a new form of infrastructure. It's immaterial, and it has its own logic. It standardizes and automates processes. That's the usage of algorithmic systems. Everything that is a process implies a certain systematization and a set of standards, which can be then formalized in mathematical language and become partially or fully automatable. So if you have a process, it is probably possible to either fully or partially automatize the process because it implies some sort of systematicism. And this standardization goes beyond cables and hardware. Automating a process with algorithmic systems implies setting a fine, invisible layer of software to permanently mediate interactions with and among all involved parties of the process. In this way, immaterial infrastructure is being built into sectors where an infrastructural dimension was unthinkable before. Think, for instance, of social media. It could be seen as a form of immaterial infrastructure in the communication sector. The current understanding of infrastructure thus needs revision. Presently, infrastructure is divided into types of categories. We either have the soft infrastructure, which denotes the institutions preserving the economic, the cultural, educational, health functions, and many other functions and sectors of a country. Or it denotes what we call hard infrastructure, which, as the historian von Lack defined, are all stable things that are necessary for mobility and exchange between people, goods, or ideas. So the cables as the stable infrastructure necessary to exchange electricity or data, or the roads for the mobility of people. An essential characteristic defining both soft and hard infrastructure is stability, whether it's procedural in the case of soft infrastructure or physical in the case of hard infrastructure. But the two types of infrastructure are definitely a form of fundamental planning to systematically design access, distribution, and interaction with goods and services that are of interest for a collective, which means public good. We're talking about the mechanisms that define how to access, how to enjoy and interact with what is considered public good in a society. And that is a fundamental aspect of political power. And that's interesting turn that the dispositive idea of Foucault brought into the conversation about political power. Because until those days, infrastructure was seen as an engineering act, a form of making politics in an apolitical way. And that was the conversation at the very beginnings of the 20th century. Engineers were thinking that they were creating the politics of a society through architectures without presenting a political position in it. And this is what Foucault was questioning. So for him, the politics of health, sexuality, or architecture were a political form. And with his studies about that, he broadened the definition of power beyond mere rules. And power became then a collection of relations of power, practices, and actions depicted in normative on the one side, but also in material infrastructure and mechanisms. Infrastructure is just the planning of power and its distribution through a set of standards embodying societal ideas of efficiency and fairness and the corresponding procedures and distribution. Based on that, I think that there are a few other characteristics that are important that define the idea of infrastructure. And I think it's important to enumerate and name all these characteristics of infrastructure because they are very much also applicable to AI systems, to complex algorithmic systems. One of them being modularity. So a relevant characteristic of infrastructure is the inherent modularity of it. Hannah Arendt was, for instance, one of the first ones in creating a fundamental criticism of the bureaucratization of murder during the Third Reich by criticizing the modularization of murder. So administration as a soft infrastructure was once seen by Max Weber as the mechanism of democracies to ensure equality before the law and its procedures in opposition to the arbitrariness of charismatic autocracies. And Hannah Arendt was one showing and describing how this administrative form of modularizing processes also entail risks. The the process of dividing the examination into standardized administrative steps or modules led individuals to decontextualize each module from the broader process and foster moral distance from its ultimate consequence. So that was that is an aspect of infrastructure that entails risk and has a specific purpose, but shows how ambivalent this type of modularization aspects entails if you do not define and you don't have an overarching moderator or responsible overseeing the whole process and understanding from an architectonical point of view the whole process and not simply each and every single module, which is one of the aspects of European thinking that sort of reflects not only the way how we construct algorithmic formulas, but also how we construct infrastructure in general and the normativity around infrastructure as well. To keep naming a few more important characteristics of infrastructure, of course, there is an interdependent character of infrastructures. Information and telecommunication infrastructures depend very much on electricity. Another relevant aspect is the unavailability of infrastructure and infrastructure goods to single households or companies, both for production and cost reasons. So take, for instance, bread. It's easy. Bread is fundamental, but it's easy to obtain the ingredients for baking bread, and everyone can bake bread for themselves. So it's not an infrastructure good, and it's not part of what would be considered infrastructure. But what is interesting when we try to explain this type of availability is when we start looking at typical infrastructural examples, infrastructure good examples, where we see that fixed costs are very different depending on the capital goods. The supply of infrastructure happens under different market forms. So mainly you either had, so one of the consequences of this unavailability is that you either have, depending on the capital good and the form of market, you have either natural monopolies like the electricity supply, or you have competition like housing construction. And while, for instance, in case of electricity, a single household might be able to afford a generator or solar panels, a constant secure supply of electricity still needs connection to the grid, and the grid itself is the infrastructure that a single household cannot afford, and many companies wouldn't either. So if we look at artificial intelligence, we see that it very much entails this aspect. It has physical prerequisites, and it's dependent of cables and hardware and electricity. It might not be stable in its ontology, but it does create a stable layer of mathematically formalized structures that are concurring or complementing the rules and constrictions and the logics given by either soft infrastructure, meaning without law, or hard infrastructure, meaning without physics, so gravity or other type of restrictions within physical infrastructure, hard infrastructure. Apart from that, of course, AI automatizes processes through technical and mathematical modularization. So each process is split into several steps depending on the technical requirements, but not necessarily the administrative and the social context. So the modularization within AI system does not necessarily reflect the modularization that we see in administrative processes or in a specific social context. And that is interesting part that needs to be needs to be stressed. AI systems, algorithmic systems, are not instruments or derivations of the rules and mechanisms of soft infrastructure. They have a different rationality running parallel to that of soft infrastructure, and consequently they require their own categorization. Of course, they are interdependent and they reflect social restrictions and legal restrictions, but there's also rationality to it that is slightly different. Social media, for example, could be seen as a form of immaterial infrastructure, as mentioned before, in the communicative sector. A software layer orchestrates the interface, the time frame, the space, and the format, be it videos, text, or pictures, in which people communicate and interact with each other. So you will have Twitter restricting the number of characters, you will have TikTok or Instagram restricting with its format, the way how you can deliver content. And this infrastructure is thus standardizing and moderating communication along with the rules and standards of soft infrastructure. In this case, that would be speech regulation or personal rights, depending on what type of content and how we regulate in specific country forms of communication. And the present market that we have in this infrastructure in the communication sector consists of monopolies defined by the format. So we have Twitter or Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. They are all concurring with each other. And they are concurring with each other because they do not replicate the format of each other, but they try to, in its core, present an alternative format of communication towards each other. Among each other. And an additional aspect of AI or algorithmic systems as immaterial infrastructure is the value at the center of its optimization rules. AI systems optimize for a specific goal or value, and that goes in detriment of other values. Does a system optimize for efficiency in the sense of pragmatism or in the sense of fairness? There's a lot of a deeper conversation that we could have about specifically this dimension when it comes to mathematizing and creating metrics of fairness and putting that as a value or orientation for or function of optimization within this type of systems. I would not like to go there within this conversation, this session now. I think it's a very different, it needs a very different session, solely focused on the idea of the metrics of fairness and how and whether this can be mathematized and systematized within algorithmic systems. But what we see is that scientists have been trying to find algorithmic formulas that are able to create the possibility of optimizing for very different values. For instance, the work of Nina Grich-Hala, she was, together with a group at the Max Planck, was trying to find algorithmic formula that would surface different metrics of fairness, depending on the idea of fairness and the stressing, whether on the process or on the outcomes, and the different factors that you want to weigh in. You can create different metrics, or different metrics of fairness have been created in this interdisciplinary conversation between ethicists, economists, and also engineers. And they were not able to find a single algorithm or to develop a single algorithm that would surface all these different metrics of fairness, which again shows that if you optimize for a specific value, this is going to go in detriment of all other values, and you will need additional measures to compensate that. So understanding that infrastructure as a term needs rethinking is key to understanding what normative instruments are needed to harness AI, but also to understand what is the relation and what expectations can an individual have when using infrastructure technologies. Because infrastructure is the architectonic expression of the politics of a society, and it impacts societies on an architectonical level, and it has rather, it has essentially a collectivistic nature or character. And because of that, the impact on the individual, it's an impact that is relatable to many other similar individuals, and goes beyond the values and aspects of individuality, because it has a different purpose. And with that, I would like to go deeper into this aspect or relationship between the individual and the collective, and how these type of technologies have an inherent friction between the idea of the self and how to systematize the self with the mathematical formulas and logics of algorithmic systems. So technically, we hear, of course, in the semantics and the products that are being delivered by artificial intelligence, that they personalize. And personalization might be perceived by the user as the technical procedure for individualization, but technically personalization is relational. It is the classification of this individual into a very specific collective of people with similarities. It does not necessarily become clear to the human concerned that he or she is being classified into a collective that might not be part of the conventionally known social categories in a society. For instance, let's take personalized advertisement and micro-targeting. It might give the impression that marketing is addressing potential consumers individually based on information about the preferences of the individual, but technically the individual is being assigned to various categories shared with many other individuals. The connection of all these categories result in an intersectional profile encompassing more categories than the usual ones, such as age, gender, and social status, which are the usual ones. And it adds additional categories that might not be in the within the social conventions and the social categories that we perceive as human beings. And this level of granularity and intersectionality is easily confused with individuality, but compartmentalization and fine granularity is not individualization. The technical and conceptual mechanisms here are very counterintuitive and not tangible, and of course the semantics are fairly wrong. Because in the very end, personalization in this technical realm, in the context of AI, is a departicularization of the individual. For algorithmic systems, it is the only way to scale both socioeconomically and technically when they are based on the average. And the statistical average doesn't capture the particular. The average is an example of an abstract individual within a collective. Real individuals do not match the average. Let's take the story of Jaume and Mr. Refray. In 1965, Mr. Refray made a deal with, on those days, a very statistically he made a deal with Miss Jaume. Jaume was an older lady. She was 92 on those days. And the deal was that he would pay her 2,500 francs every month as long as she lived. And then when she died, he would take her apartment. Now, the average age of a woman in France on those days was 72, and she was 92 on those days. So it seems like quite a good deal. But Jean Comment became world famous because she was she became the oldest woman alive. She even died 2 years after Mr. Raffray, who had to pay way more for the apartment than what he statistically, based on statistics, had expected to have to pay. He never put a foot in that apartment, and Ms. Calment made, quite on the contrary, was the one making the very good deal. So that's example of the real life, the individual, the particularities of an individual versus the average statistics. The self in statistics, in the mathematics of AI, becomes structured. The self becomes structured not on particularities, but on pattern commonalities, on categorizations. And categorizations are restrictions. Categorizations are unable to capture the fluidity and ambivalence of identity and its dynamics. With this, what we have is statistical concepts of fine granular cells that are being created. So what we have is software products that are standardizing ideas of personalization, ideas of cells based on average. And to a certain extent, this is an industrialization of the self and an infrastructuralization of the self. AI technology is built an infrastructure that helps model services for individual use, but with a collective character. If we take, for instance, let's say GPS technologies to find the fastest routes according not only to geographical distance, but also based on other less foreseeable factors like traffic density, whether there's a jam or an accident, and so on. That is actually based on measuring the movements of the single users of these GPS apps or programs to see whether the single cars of the individuals are moving or not. And if they are not moving, we will assume that there is some sort of traffic jam or problem in the road. And that information is going to be transmitted to all other users of that app. Or take, for instance, the contact tracing apps that we are starting to use in some countries, tracing in a very anonymous way whether people have been in interaction with someone that has gotten COVID. There, in this type of apps, individuals are not only users of that infrastructure, but they become part of the infrastructure themselves. They are not only, so to say, metaphorically users of the road, but they are part of the pavement of that road. So these GPS systems become accurate as because they, to the extent or depending on how many people are using those services and contributing with their data and with their movements to the quality of those services. And that's a very, one of the most particular ways and characteristics of how the West, the European region, but also American societies are developing immaterial infrastructure. The infrastructures that are being created are being created with the individual in mind and no sense of societal interdependence and relatedness, even though they are infrastructure and they are necessarily a collectivistic tool. And and that is where the friction starts. And part of becoming an individual is social. Part of becoming an individual is the social nature of human beings, our relatedness to each other. So getting a sense of that interrelatedness is part of the precondition to our humanity. It takes town to raise a child, and European thinking has, to a certain extent, specifically in law, a blind spot there, because the way how we develop law, but also the way how we are developing services with this type of new technologies, put the individual radically at the center of the purposes of AI, but also at the center of the methodologies, be the methodologies, the statistical methodologies and the statistical approaches within AI systems, be it on the normative level. Democracies are, as the philosopher Philippa Foot put it, systems that have a radical methodological individualism from the law dogmatic perspective, and in many ethical ideologies, not all, but especially in law, we see that there's this methodological individualism that does not understand societies and does not understand collectives, because it puts the individual at its center. So this means fundamental rights are individual rights. This means that the way how you address unfairness and the law process is based on individual-centered procedures. And that becomes complicated when you have societal problems. And this is an expression of a very old European thinking that has been present since the Middle Ages to our days. There are three to four aspects in European thinking that have been shaping not only the way how we create machines and how we create algorithmic code, but also how we create law and think about society. One of it is essentialism. Contrary to other cultures, we, in the history of law and constitutionalism and the narratives that explain how democracy is legitimate, we see philosophers and law experts concentrating first in defining the essence of a human being. This is what it's called essentialism. So it's very much the basis of a democratic society starts by the definition of human nature. And this is something that tries, and this is an approach that tries to capture the essence of a human being, which is quite different in contrast to many other cultures that don't understand the idea of identity as an essence that can be captured and have a rather procedural understanding of identity, which actually allows for identities to change, identities to develop, and do not focus on capturing and categorizing the essence, but understand, like for instance, Ubuntu, the identity as something relational that it's also very much based on the interactions and the context and the existence of other beings. There are societies in the African continent, to put an example, that understand identity as a process, and with that, just to quote a different culture, they don't, or to quote Tolstoy, they do not think that it is necessary to define what is the human being, to define the rules of behavior. So you don't need to understand, would say Tolstoy, who you are to understand what you should or you shouldn't do. It's not a precondition. And again, the question of categorization is a question that we see not only in the tools, the algorithmic tools that we develop, but also very much in law and ethical thinking. Added to that dimension, there's the universalistic or the idea to universalize, and the propension to universalize this sort of human essence. And universalism also very much runs into this categorization idea that things can be, as human beings, can be captured in its essence, and that this categorization can apply across all contexts and continents and cultures. And of course, what we see is that not only because identity very much can be seen from different cultures in a different way, but also because, of course, creating categories of a human being, it's always a hard task. There is always going to be people that do not belong to a specific category, that remain between the categories and are unnamed, unseen, and very much rely on the acknowledgement of themselves by on being named. And of course that this is something that you can avoid by not concentrating on that. But is very much required by the essentialism and universalistic thinking that we have both in the algorithmic infrastructures that we're creating, but also in our European law cultures. So there's an organicism and interaction between this soft infrastructure and this immaterial infrastructure that is forcing each other to create concepts of the self that are mathematically and inherently difficult to do, because of course the mathematical approach of algorithmic systems is not individualistic but a collectivistic approach. While on the other side we have a law approach that is inherently individualistic. It, to a certain extent, is an approach that is trying to regulate societies by just regulating each individual. But we have a tool here that is an infrastructural tool. It's not about the individuals. This is like a tool for the woods, or this is a form to understand a technology that will help you metaphorically to understand the woods. But the regulations that we have there in democracies are regulations that put the trees in its center. So to a certain extent, it's trying to get a hold and regulate the woods by regulating each single tree. And what we see there is that there is a friction and a tension that makes it very difficult, because like the woods, like the forest, societies are more than the sum of all trees and the sums of all individuals. There's much more to a society that the sum of the interest of all the individuals and all individuals in it. And this dimension, the fact that societies not only have an individualistic dimension that needs acknowledgement and that needs protection, but that there are also societal issues that cannot be regulated, that are unable to respond to individualistic logics, but require more infrastructural and more societal logics. This is one friction. At the other side, this essentialistic approach and universalistic idea of being able to create categories that capture the essence of human beings leads to bias, requires seeing everything, requires something that our world cannot do, because in the moment where you capture the essence, that's one shot in time. This is not able to foresee what will happen in the future. It's not able to capture the dynamics and the development of human beings. Of course, when we try to bring all this together, when we try to personalize through those logical systems, what we see are also the frictions of the inability to create technologies that bring together our cultures and also the logics of the system itself. So right now what we have is a fundamental friction between the nature of immaterial infrastructure and its logics on the one side, and on the other side our cultural ideas of the self that have been very much marked by a form of thinking that ironically also marks the and also characterizes algorithmic thinking, which is this this propension in the history of democratic normativity in the legal realm to categorize, to essentialize, to universalize, and these different layers of and logics of thinking have both informed laws and mathematics on the one side, but on the other side run contrary to each other. And understanding these frictions is fundamental to understand that by approaching this type of technologies through categorizations of the self, by trying to systematize the self and mathematize the self, what we are creating is not assistance and an acknowledgement of particularity and individuality, but we are structuring and systematizing the self in such a way that the self is being eroded and to a certain extent industrialized in ideas of the self that correspond to averages, to statistical averages that are then being made productive in this new form of infrastructure by creating and becoming part of these infrastructures without having a sense of the others. So ironically, if we want to create technologies that are able to safeguard the self, we're going to need infrastructures that make us aware of the others, that make us aware of the societal dimension of immaterial infrastructure, and that fosters a balancing between individual thinking and individual logics and collective logics. So artificial intelligence based infrastructures might not be the best place to foster the self, but it might be a place to reflect about the societal impact of things, and with that cultivate the balance between our social dimension and our individual particularities.